one of the real main focuses that we have is to help the students and the attendees to understand the terminology. So that's really the starting point for us. So at the foundation level, we want the IT organizations to have a shared lexicon whereby they can discuss these things. They can discuss, for example, the difference between an incident and a problem and how you handle each one of those. And it is very different how you handle an incident versus how you handle a problem. Even in some of the organizations where there has been a little bit of resistance to a more formalized process, I've worked with some government organizations where it really wasn't as critical for them to become certified, for example, but what they did find in going through the classes and going through some of this education was that they found that all of a sudden people were using words like incident, and they were understanding the difference between a normal and standard change, and there was really that common understanding that was very helpful to the organization. So I'll share some of that terminology with you all at this point. In the ITIL v3 guidance, we talk about good practices. So a lot of times we're, in IT, we want to go with the best practices. What are the industry best practices? And the feeling or thought is, in the ITIL framework, that best practices are really for perhaps the top 5% of all IT organizations. And really what we want to focus on first is, what are the good practices? What are the common sense things? What are the things that are really not optional? We start with those first. So a lot of times, instead of talking about best practices, which might seem unattainable, we're talking about just some common sense good practices. Some of the other terminology, and especially relevant to what we're going to be going over today, are things like utility and warranty. Excuse me. So when we talk about providing value for the services that we are offering in IT, we want to be sure that we have the appropriate levels of utility and warranty, and they're both equally important. Utility roughly translates to the requirements or the features. So does the service that we're providing meet or exceed the requirements of the business? And does it have all of the appropriate features, the bells and whistles that the business is looking for? Equally important is the level of warranty, meaning, is this a reliable service? And there are some certain aspects of warranty that we look at when we are designing a service, and we'll talk about those a little bit later when we talk about service design. Some other considerations within service strategy is understanding what the capabilities and resources are of our IT organization. And again, we look a lot at resources. Resources are those tangible things. So the resources may be servers and software and headcount and network infrastructure. But equally important are the capabilities. So what is the management structure? Is it designed in a way that supports the goals of the IT organization? What are the individual skill sets of the staff within IT? Those are all speak to our capabilities. We want to be sure that we are maintaining appropriate levels of capabilities and resources within the IT organization. Another term I've mentioned already is the service catalog. So when I talked about complementary guidance, there has been increasing focus that we've observed among our customers on the service catalog, and how do we design a process for service request management? How do we make the services that IT provides more accessible to our end users, to our customers? So the service catalog takes an approach that goes a step beyond, or perhaps a few steps beyond, categorizations. So when we first start with an incident management implementation, for example, for a customer, we're often focused on the categorizations. How do you categorize the requests that come in? Going beyond that, though, when we look at services, services are not just the categories, but they also encompass what are the supporting services. So you may have something general like email as a service. We also, when we design a service catalog, we start to understand how email is supported, what the supporting services are. So the customer may just have a question about email. They understand it from a service perspective. They don't necessarily need or want to understand that email is supported by an Exchange server and an Outlook client and the network infrastructure and so on and so forth. So really looking, what the service catalog provides us is an understanding of the relationships and the impacts that are going to affect the IT services that we provide. And it also looks at IT from the perspective of the customer or the end user. Finally, another piece of ITIL terminology, the Deming cycle is not certainly specific to ITIL. It was developed many decades ago by W. Edwards Deming, who was a kind of the total quality management guru and a statistician who built on this idea of having a cycle, and this is really what is the core of continual service improvement. The Deming cycle is also sometimes called the PDCA, or Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. And it's this thought that, when we look at the initial planning and the implementation, it doesn't really stop there. We want to continue with the checking or reporting and ultimately acting or taking corrective action. So that's something important that I want everyone to keep in mind, that as we go through these phases of the life cycle, to understand it's not intended to be a once and done life cycle. This is certainly going to be iterative. So there are, you may start and stop at different points, but there's surrounding this whole ITIL life cycle is this concept of plan, do, check, act, continually evaluating and reevaluating the performance, the satisfaction levels of your end users, and the overall efficiency and effectiveness of your IT organization. A few other basic concepts before we look at service strategy and service design. So when we talk about ITIL, we focus a lot on roles. So we want to understand the difference between process owners and service owners, for example. In smaller organizations, process owners and service owners will often wear multiple hats. So very important here, note to note, roles do not equal job descriptions. In larger organizations, you may have multiple owners over a process or multiple owners over a particular service. So to illustrate this a little bit more, how these process owners and service owners work together, there are some intersections. So a process owner, or one of the process owner titles, would be incident manager. Now, the incident manager often is the service desk manager. He or she would be responsible for the overall incident management process lifecycle. It does not mean that the service desk manager or the incident manager is going to be answering every call that comes in, but he or she is responsible for the process and making sure that the process is performing as designed. Of course, those process managers are going to interface with the multiple service owners. So the incident manager, for example, will need to be trained on, or will need to make sure that the people who are performing the incident management process, that they have training and understanding of the email service, of the network service, of the servers, and so on. And the same applies for the other process owners. The service owners, in turn, for example, if I am the email service owner, which might be the email administrator, I need to make sure that I am interfacing with the incident manager and providing support information. I need to provide support for the project problem manager if there is an outage, for example, or other type of consistent issues that are coming up. I may need to address those as a problem. If I have a planned upgrade, I need to coordinate with the change manager and so on. Another way to look at the areas of responsibility between and among the teams is to look at the RACI matrix, and this is another core teaching of the ITIL life cycle. It's not, again, unique to ITIL, but it is a good way of mapping out the accountability, responsibility for the various activities within IT, and also identifying who needs to be consulted, who needs to be informed. The rule here is that there should only be one person ultimately accountable for any particular activity, but there may be multiple people who are responsible, consulted, and/or informed. Nancy, I'll pause here again for questions before I go on to the actual service strategy component.
Hi, Nikki. You can go ahead with the service strategy component, and
okay.
We'll address questions after that. Thanks.
All right. I'll pause again just before we get started with service design. So service strategy ensures that every stage of the service life cycle stays focused on the business case and relates to all the companion process elements that follow. So each phase of the life cycle is comprised of multiple processes. In service strategy, we have processes to include service portfolio management, financial management, demand management, and you'll see the two that are listed here highlighted in green, strategy and business relationship management. I've highlighted them here because those were new additions to version 2011 of the ITIL v3 framework. So I'll talk a little bit about these individual processes, but I'll first start with just some of the general concepts within service strategy. There are 4 basic activities in service strategy. The first is defining the market. So you may think that this is just a function of the marketing team, but really it is important if you are going to be an integral part of the business. IT does need to understand the market, understand the patterns of business activity. So there are a number of ways that we illustrate this, and I think most organizations do a fair job of this. So, for example, when we are dealing with universities, IT departments know that typically there is a blackout period, or we know that they're not going to be scheduling any work to be done around the registration period or when school starts, because that is going to be a busy time of the year. So a lot of times when we work with universities, we do work over the summertime. Excuse me. Likewise, if we're working with a retail organization, we know that the Christmas season is going to be very busy for them, and they are going to need to have blackout periods for changes during those times of the year. So just understanding what the cycles are, it may not be an overall business cycle. So maybe, for example, you know that for your organization's finance team that you're not going to want to impact any of the finance systems at the end of month when they're doing their end of month reporting. So again, it's important for the IT organization to understand the patterns of business activity.